talking about security a lot, about commercial satellites, about modules. Now we're just about to talk on the applicability of zero trust to the space domain. To introduce the subject, I have with me Carlos Garcia Cordero, an executive consultant at CGI. CGI, who's also a sponsor of our event, and we would like to address our thanks and gratefulness to CGI. So to briefly introduce you, Carlos Garcia Cordero, you're a specialist in crafting security systems embedded with machine learning technology.
That's correct.
You've acquired more than 14 years of experience applying cybersecurity to many different sectors, education, entertainment, the public sector. Talking about entertainment, I know you're a musician yourself.
I do.
Wonderful. You've also contributed to academic research, you're a security engineer and system designer. So you've been actually dealing with cybersecurity in many different environments. I hope you will tell us what is specific to the space domain.
Mm-hmm.
I will leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. Today I think I want to talk to you about a topic that I believe in the past was much talked about as something that was going to revolutionize security in general. And whether this is true or not, I do feel that zero trust, specific to the domain of space, is something that is being considered, is a rather important thing that we should still keep considering, that I want to talk to you about exactly. So, I'm going to introduce the topic for all of you, why zero trust is important, talk about zero trust, not in too much detail, but enough detail for you to understand what zero trust is, how it gets to be implemented, and how it works in space. Finally, I'm going to talk about how we implement this in space infrastructure, and we'll just talk about other things at the end. So important to note is I am working for CGI, and in case you don't know, CGI, this is a large company that provides a lot of IT-related services, and we have a bunch of different things, but we do specialize a lot into the security domain. We have large amounts of clients all over the world. We control and operate different CSOCs, security operation centers, and we do have the experience not only in security but also in space, and we are good at mixing them up together. So now let's start talking about zero trust when it comes to the space domain. But to begin with, I want to talk to you about security and critical infrastructure. We all know about critical infrastructure. I think we know why it is important to think about securing critical infrastructure. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about the banking system or maybe just public infrastructure, large public infrastructure. We're talking about communications, for example, communication networks, smart cities, even if you want to think about it, energy providers. And I think that the common denominator when it comes to critical infrastructure is there's millions of users, billions of connections, trillions of bytes going always through the systems, meaning that there's large attack surface area at all points in time. And when it comes to the space domain, we are approaching this specific issue as well. Just take a look at these numbers, for example. We have 38 countries now that have remote sensing systems up there. We have 45 countries with communication equipment up there, 6 countries with navigation systems, and 38 countries with science and technology equipment up there. So essentially, space is becoming critical infrastructure if it is not already critical infrastructure. It depends on how you see it. But the important aspect of things is we can also look at the number of satellites that are up there. There's a massive explosion of this in the recent years, of course, due to the constellations that are coming up. But this trend will continue, meaning that if we take a look at something like how it used to be some almost 60 years ago, in both LEO and GEO, for example, we see that there's an explosion of space actors, but there's also the growth of satellite constellations. What I'm trying to say is space is critical infrastructure, if not. Important to note, though, is that critical infrastructure always has to deal with this whole concept of how do I secure my infrastructure such that I can keep providing my services to millions of people without disruption, for example. And we can see that when it comes to analyzing critical infrastructure, from a report from 2022 from IBM, this is all in relation to critical infrastructure. These are the type of attacks that you get to expect when you talk about this type of infrastructure. And most importantly, the costs. It's important to note that on average, critical infrastructure has to pay about 4.8 million for each data breach, and that 79% of everyone that has to deal with critical infrastructure do not yet implement advanced security mechanisms such as zero trust. However, it has been demonstrated as well, or at least claiming to the report, that by just implementing things like zero trust, it's possible to save up to $1 million when there is a data breach or some type of problem. So to keep going about this and to explain why zero trust is so important, let's talk about first what do we think when we think about classical cybersecurity. In classical cybersecurity, we think about proactive security measurements. That is, what happens or what do we do before an attack takes place. We talk about reactive security mechanisms, what happens afterwards. Fantastic. And it's not much talked about, but it's implicit always in there, which is the trust management. And that is what happens when we use the system, while we use the system. And we usually boil this down to how do we use VPNs, how do we connect to our systems. Maybe we have DM sets for clients or the public to connect to our systems, these sort of things. This is what I mean with trust management. And let's talk a little bit more about this. In order to do this, I'm going to also talk about zero trust, of course. In traditional trust management, we consider the whole thing as we have this zone out there, very large, that we don't trust. And I also have this other zone, which I do trust, that I control, where my systems are located. And I usually want to have some type of security measure in the middle that would allow people to go, for example, or clients or my systems to traverse into this zone of trust so that I can have then my operators working within this zone. The problem, however, is that even if these security measures are in place and working correctly, we still have to address the problem of what happens when insiders start doing things that are not supposed to be done. What happens when insiders have an agenda inside that is not according to our way of how we want to do things. That is, lateral movement when something happens inside my trust zone is a problem that can be addressed with technologies such as zero trust. Now, zero trust, however, is tricky when we talk about it, because most of us think that zero trust is a technology, but it's not. Zero trust in reality is divided into multiple things, but most important to think about is zero trust is more a philosophy. So zero trust is this philosophy of having a particular way of thinking about security that is having some principles on the side, or as giving it support. In this case, it's the least privilege and need to know principle. And then on top of all this, then there's the technology that implements the zero trust philosophy on top of the principles. Let me talk about each one of these in more detail. When we talk about the philosophy of zero trust, I think this is not that difficult to understand. Most of you most probably do know what zero trust is, but the important thing is you don't trust anyone. No one outside or inside of your networks. Fantastic. We assume that everyone can get compromised. Not everyone, but also everything. My systems, the people inside, for example. We verify everyone and everything. We verify every connection. And we do not care where the connections come from. That is, we disregard location when it comes to this. And when it comes to the space domain, assuming there's no trust by default is tricky. Because traditionally, or it would mean that we don't have to trust ground stations. We don't have to trust even the satellites or the control center. But this is something that zero trust promises, that we don't have to trust these entities, for example, in my systems, and we can still work and have the security that we want in this philosophy. The philosophy, of course, is backed up by these principles of least privilege, and the important aspect to know is that there's essentially, when it comes to least privilege and need to know, three pillars that we have to talk about. There is the identity, context, and security posture, which I'll go into more detail in a bit. And in the space domain, this implies that we have to verify ground networks. We have to verify payload ingestion points, for example, RF communication links. So the things we typically do not think that need verification, well, we do need verification for these things. These three pillars are it's rather interesting because, yes, identity is this concept of figuring out who it is that is using the system. Is the user authorized, or the system, or the machine, for example, and authenticated? But we can also think about the context of the user. This is part of the principles of Zero Trust, where there's a context where the user is located, so to say, that involves the attributes of the user. In which country, with which laptop are you working, in which network are you connected, which programs do you have installed, for example. And it's also this concept of I have dedicated channels for my users, perfect. And I also have this concept of a security posture. How is your device looking like? Do you have the latest patch that I want you to have in your system? Are you running the correct operating system, antivirus software, etc.? And all of this by itself is great, and it's sort of something that we already use in other legacy systems, for example, legacy security. But by its own, it's also not enough, because this still would allow me, after I've done all this, if someone decides to go rogue and say, no, 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 I'm just going to start changing things that I'm not supposed to change, well, the thing that prevents this in Zero Trust is this whole concept of doing continuous verification and monitoring and validation, meaning that through the entire process of you having to use your system or connect it to your systems, there's always continuous verification and monitoring. If anything changes in the context, in your identity, in your security posture, then I can, for example, abort the connection or stop what's happening. And this is something that empowers Zero Trust to prevent all this lateral movement, for example. Now, the technology, however, the thing that gets to implement all these principles and philosophy, well, there are many. Many vendors call them differently, CTNA, SDP, or reverse proxy, SDP, things like this. And for the space domain, establishing Zero Trust would mean that you need to integrate all these technologies into operators and users, which is a challenge. You need to include all segments, not only the ground segment, for example, but you have to try to integrate all segments. And you have to also take into account the challenges of integrating legacy hardware, which of course is something that we cannot avoid. Now, let me just briefly explain to you what, as an example, a technology in CTNA might look like. CTNA is based on this concept of having what we call a trust broker. This trust broker can be either located in premise or in the cloud. This doesn't matter. Remember, in Zero Trust, location doesn't matter at all. And let's say that a user would like to connect into an application that I host. Maybe it's application A or application B. The user would then request access to this trust broker. And the trust broker will then establish this connection or contact the application, figure out if the right identity, context, and security posture are there to establish a link. This is a link only specific to the user. Notice how this link didn't exist before the user contacted the trust broker. And also, important to note, in this link, through the entire communication, there's always verification of the identity, context, and security posture. And it keeps happening, keeps happening. If anything changes, this link can immediately be broken. And Zero Trust promises that I will not be able to connect to any other application, so for example, application B, through this link. It doesn't exist. There's no physical way or virtual way to connect to the service if the trust broker doesn't enable this connection to me. There's no TCP IP connection that I can, for example, do. So that is Zero Trust in a nutshell. Then what does this all mean when it comes to space and the space infrastructure? Well, this is how I envision a complex infrastructure that is composed of the ground segment, space segment, link segment, and the user segment. Usually it's a little bit more complicated. We have the control centers, the payload ground segment, for example, data points, the users and the clients. And it's important to note that at every single point, there could be problems. You could have different types of attacks that target the space segment, different types of attacks target the ground segments, for example, the user segments, and of course also the communication and the antennas and all these frequencies that are usually considered to be safe. And this is rather important. You know, I'm talking about jamming, intercepting, replay attacks, denial of service attacks, all these type of things that are usually not considered. So what happens now is that I don't need to tell you this is a problem. It's out there already. I mean, in the last few, not even years, but months, we've learned about a bunch of different problems out there that might give us, you know, a pointer towards the fact that we still need to do a little bit more. It's not just enough to secure the ground systems, for example, the ground segment, but we have to do something more about it. What about the space segment? What about the link segment, which is a rather critical one as well? Well, in this context, if we just think about a more condensed infrastructure, we can think that there's still quite a lot of challenges that we have to overcome. That is, how do we integrate legacy applications on hardware? How do we keep up this idea of relying on trusted zones, which is very typical in the space domain? How do we deal with communication latency? Because you need to contact in the zero trust, for example, architecture, a trust broker, and the trust broker might wait. What if the trust broker is up there in the space segment? These sort of challenges are there. And we have to consider that there's also onboard limitations in our space segment. However, and I argue, with the current technology that we have, we can find a combination of different paradigms that would involve hardware and software to enable zero trust in most segments. And this is the key aspect of things, most segments. Because I believe that we still need to develop new technologies in a few places that I will highlight in a second. Let's say that, all right, this sounds fantastic. I would like to do something about it. Zero trust is interesting to me. If we think about the benefits of what this might bring, and I put them in the context of the cyber kill chain, we can see that zero trust would help me to avoid a bunch of problems already, just by the fact that I implement zero trust, pretty much almost for free, without me having to do anything else. Meaning that immediately I would be defending myself against problems on my ground stations, problems with relay satellites, with trusted satellites, and I wouldn't have to worry about, for example, rogue ground systems or rogue satellites out there. This wouldn't be a problem because zero trust would be able to solve it if implemented appropriately. Now, in order to implement zero trust, however, there's many challenges, there's many technologies. And the whole idea is that if we take all these different technologies that already exist, and we sort of figure out a way to come up with an architecture, let's say something like that. I just came up with it. And I say, we put something that might look like this, that would implement zero trust. Of course, there would be still quite a lot of problems or challenges to solve, such as how do I manage parts of the system, which technologies I use, where do I place it on the cloud, on premises, how do I transition into it? This whole roll-in topic, it's rather complicated, and how do I integrate it into legacy systems? But let's say that I can come up with a solution to all of these things, and I believe that all of these things do have solutions. It's just not that easy, but they do have solutions with the current technologies and with the current things that we do. With this in mind, we would no problem be able to implement zero trust in the ground segment, in the user segment, and partially in the link segment. This is no problem. This would be able to secure then user to application communication, user to ground station communication, machine to machine communication, and everything has to do with talking to the ground stations. But this is the key aspect of that I want you to leave with. There's still some things that are lacking out there. And these are the things related to how do we manage to implement zero trust in the link segment and the space segment. That is, how do I get to have my ground stations talking to my satellites, or the satellites themselves talking to other satellites in constellations using a zero-trust approach. There's currently no technology that implements this, and I want to encourage people to think about it. How can I develop maybe technology in this field? Maybe when it comes to ground station to satellite communication, we can think of SDR, software-defined radios, something like this, that would enable me to create channels on the fly only when requested. But this is the key aspect. How could we tackle this whole thing of implementing zero trust in this last two segments? Thank you very much. I am hopeful that you have any questions or any comments about my talk, but that would be all from my side.
Thank you very much, Carlos Cordero. We have questions from the audience. I don't know if the participants all know about the application Connects Me. You can raise your question on Connects Me. You'd rather talk. You'd rather talk. I will handle you a microphone so that participants can hear you.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you for your speech. I'm very glad to see the Zero Trust topic mentioned here. I was looking forward to your presentation. So we've been talking about this concept for a little, well, not me personally, but the industry has been talking about this concept for more than 20 years on and off now. But I was really hopeful to get your ideas on actually, you've listed the ideal architecture and also the threats related to that. And I was actually wondering whether you have some concrete examples of how to actually apply the methodology and the technologies you've described inside that architecture. And the second point to this question, and I have actually another one after, if I can make it as well. You've talked about, and you've mentioned the policy engine, and actually like the policy evaluation points and policy enforcement points are a huge part of how you build zero trust like architectures. So if you could maybe also identify these in the space industry, like for a space company operating both ground and space infrastructure.
Of course. One of the key aspects of zero trust is where do I place my what we call the PDPs, or the policy decision points, all these engines that make zero trust work. And typically speaking, we tend to implement and put these things in the cloud. And we know that the cloud, sometimes in the space sector, and I mean the public cloud, might not be as desirable, let's say, sometimes. I do not know if this is the good way to go or not, but what I do know is that it is possible currently to implement a cloud solution. It can be a local cloud, a private cloud solution, that implements these, for example, gateways such that they are highly reliable, they are resilient to attacks, because that's the issue. Sometimes with zero trust, it seems that there's one single point of failure, but that's not the case. You have to also consider that if you have this cloud-based ecosystem, then there's no problem. Or at least you have to have some sort of way to diversify the connections that go into your system in multiple ways, but it is still possible. Now, probably your question goes into where do I place these things? I argue that the correct way to place them is somewhere along the ground segment, but that we will need also specific points in the space segment. So satellites, for example, that might run hardware, specific hardware, that are able to do the work of the policy enforcement, for example, points or even gateways, so that communication that takes up there can rely on the links up there instead of having to go to the ground stations, because this has some latency and you want communications to be fast. So a solution would require to have both systems in both places with some coordination, for example, of synchronizing policies or synchronizing communication. This is my answer, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, so then we are still mainly talking about let's say, the enterprise segment, which is the same situation as we face currently in the ICS space, where it's something to do in the enterprise segment, but actually in the OT segment, it's a bit more complicated, and we can't zero trust our way around that. And my second question then would be, You've talked about I do implement zero trust or to implement zero trust, and let's pretend I'm a space company, but how do I actually know that I have implemented zero trust?
I didn't get the last part, sorry. Could you repeat it?
How do I actually know that I implemented zero trust?
How do you know that you implemented it? That's very interesting. When you no longer need to connect to a VPN and your system is not hacked, you have zero trust.
Okay, no comment on that.
There's no easy answer.
Oh, I think, yeah, okay. Do we have any more questions from the room? I have one. So you've been an AI and security expert, we've said, in many various domains.
Right.
At the beginning of your presentation, you said that zero trust was also a philosophy, thinking that threats are not only located outside the organization, but can come from within. And this is something you showed perfectly with the statistics that make human errors more a threat than ransomware or other things. Talking about the space domain, talking about culture of enterprise, of companies, of domains also, would you say that the space domain, given your experience in other fields, areas, industry, is more listening or more reluctant to introducing zero trust?
I wouldn't say that it's reluctant or listening. I would say that it wants to stay on the safe side, usually. And that means that I first need to see it working. I need to see the benefits of it for me in order to move in that direction. But the good thing is that this has already started to happen. I know of a lot of initiatives to try to get zero trust implemented in agencies, for example, and organizations, all related to space, because they figured out if the big companies out there, if the big cloud providers, those that have thousands upon thousands of systems, users, and employees are using this, what stops me, the space sector, which in comparison to some other sectors out there, like the finance sector, is rather small, what impedes me to do this? And I believe that we're currently heading in this direction. I have no doubt that this is the way to do things currently and where we're heading.
Okay, you've been advocating very well, we must say. So, it's been existing for 20 years, one of participants said, and still it is necessary to advocate. So, final question, what would be the catch? What would be the catch for zero trust?
The catch is that implementing zero trust is not as free as it sounds, because you have to break a lot of barriers if you want to implement this concept, this model. Just to think that there's no trust anywhere is rather challenging. That's the first catch. And the second catch is you have to convince everyone that you don't need a VPN, that I don't need specific areas where I can work, that it's just a matter of you have to trust that the policy engine knows what it's doing and that the connections that are created are sufficient. And this is a tricky aspect of things. You just don't want to trust this blindly. Zero trust in the end, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we can give you another round of applause.
Thank you.